Welcome to the CNS Podcast featuring Dr. Daryl Anaba, Research Director for CNS Productions.
Last Friday, October 3rd, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1424, the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. This historic act was passed and signed almost immediately by President Bush because of the horrendous economic climate we were experiencing at that time. Going unnoticed was 20 bills attached to the passage of that act. I guess to get the votes, they had to attach 20 other votes to it. And the most significant vote, the most significant bill was the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008. Now, David Wellstone, son of the late Senator Paul Wellstone, who had pioneered this bill, was elated that after 12 years of struggle and lobbying, that this historic Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act had finally passed. But I look at the history of that act, and it really goes way before that 12-year period. For me, it starts with Dr. Judd, who was the director of National Institute of Health, originally named under President Reagan, and then he was there until 1990, so he went into the Bush Senior administration. But during his time, Louis Judd sort of was the architect of the mental health, the science behind the Mental Health Parity Act, the first Parity Act. What happens is that in 1989, as director of NIH, Louis Judd was able to talk both houses of Congress, and then later became international, to declare that the 1990s would be named the decade of the brain, the decade of the mind. More resources would be poured into understanding this tissue, or this part of our bodies that make us so different from every other creature on this planet, the human mind and the human consciousness. And what he does is he does a brilliant thing. He just, first of all, he was able to show that the incidence, the annual prevalence, the lifetime prevalence of mental illness far surpass all the other physical illnesses we have to look after or to deal with. The second thing he did was he also showed that during the decade of the brain, that mental illness costs American economy a lot more lost dollars than all the physical illnesses combined, and mental illness suffered from a great stigma and a great bias when it came to insurance companies and from the government, as well as getting treatment and resources for people to help deal with that. And he knew that that stigma came from the fact that the problems of mental illness, or the diseases of mental illness, were hidden away behind skull and skin and hair, and you really couldn't see the differences in a people's brains that robbed them of sort of natural thinking process or regular thinking process. So what he set to do was he set to objectify, or he set about showing that you can diagnose mental illness based upon the technology that we had arrived at by the 1990s, based upon MRI scans, based upon looking at functional PET scans in different ways of imaging the brain, and also looking at different enzymes and tissue systems, that he could show that somebody with thought disorder, somebody with affective disorder, major depression, somebody with bipolar disease actually had physiological and biological differences that robbed them of their ability to function like somebody who didn't have those differences in their brain. And with that, he was able, within only 6 years of the decade of the brain, to put forth with Senator Wellstone, Paul Wellstone, the late Paul Wellstone, and then with Pete Domenici, they championed a bill called the Mental Health Parity Act. And the Mental Health Parity Act was signed by Bill Clinton in 1996. It was a time of great celebration in the mental health field. Everybody was slapping high fives. Everybody's happy. But I was extremely depressed because the Mental Health Parity Act omitted substance use disorders, omitted alcoholism, omitted addiction. And part of the research that Lou Judd had stimulated really showed that substance use disorders was more prevalent than even mental health disorders. he showed that substance abuse disorders cost American economy more lost dollars than mental health disorders. And finally, I think the most importantly, he began to pioneer the science and push forward the science, now with Nora Volkow, head of NIDA, even moving further in that, to show that substance use disorder could be diagnosed through objective parameters by MRI scans and functional MRI scans, PET scans, and the other types of way of looking at our brain and noting that the brain of somebody with alcoholism or the brain of somebody who's predisposed to addiction was different than a normie brain. So it should have been that substance abuse should have been included in the original Mental Health Parity Act. But when asked about it, I saw Judd during his celebration. He was quick to point out that there was so much stigma and bias about mental illness that you can multiply that by 1,000, and that's the amount of stigma and bias there is about substance abuse, and that the Mental Health Parity Act had no chance in passing had they added at the time substance abuse disorder. So it said we all now have our work cut out to start working on the Substance Abuse Parity Act. Well, David Wellstone celebrated that after 1996, 12 years later, we finally have the passage of the Addiction Equity Act as part of a renewed or advanced Mental Health Parity Act. So we have this huge bill that makes a big difference and puts forth a new way of accepting that addiction, alcoholisms, and all substance abuse disorders are really biological conditions. They are not a weak-willed person. They're not somebody who's just trying to shirk responsibilities, but they are conditions or disorders of people who have a different brain that robs them of their ability to control their use of drugs once they start, and then makes it very difficult for them to stay stopped when they have a strong desire to stay stopped. Now, the differences in terms of the first act, the Mental Health Parity Act of 1996, banned the limits of annual and lifetime spending that insurance companies would do on mental health issues. Before, insurance companies can say, well, we'll treat cancer in this way, we'll treat diabetes this way. But when it comes to mental health, you have a lifetime limit in terms of how much we're going to spend on it, and you also have an annual limit. Well, the Parity Act, Mental Health Parity Act of 1996 says they couldn't do that. They had to treat they had to treat mental health the same way that they treated diabetes, epilepsies, cancers, heart disease, hypertension, things like that. Well, what was added on the new Mental Health Parity Act and Addiction Equity Act of 2008 is they banned also the charging of different co-pays, the charging of different deductibles, and different treatment limitations. For instance, some insurance companies say, well, we won't do residential care, or we'll limit residential care for only a certain amount, or we can only do outpatient. Well, they said you couldn't do that. You had to treat substance abuse or addiction in the same way you treated all other diseases. It's going to mean a huge thing for the addiction treatment community. What had happened after the Mental Health Parity Act, many states on their own went forward and one by one started passing their own Substance Abuse Parity Act within the state. The state of Oregon was one of those states who passed their own state version of a Substance Abuse Parity Act. But what occurred was that many insurance companies would move out of state. They would find loopholes. They would hold that the federal government didn't require this. And so the application of that parity or the real use of that parity was not as great as we were hoping it would be. We were hoping that insurance companies in the private sector would begin to pick up a lot of the treatment for substance abuse that they've been avoiding for all these years. I think by 2008, by the passage of this recent act, there were only about 8 states that didn't have some form of substance abuse parity enacted. But with the federal act coming forward, I think it's going to eliminate many of those loopholes, and we finally have the ability for people who have insurance and who are able to afford insurance to be able to access their insurance to provide them with the treatment they need for substance abuse and alcoholism and the other problems that drugs bring about in our communities.
That wraps our pod for today. Thanks for visiting the CNS Podcast. Please check back soon for the next in the series and visit our website, www.cnsproductions.com.